Welcome to today's ALA Solutions Series webinar, a masterclass on reducing your firm's travel emissions. I would like to thank today's sponsor, Reed Mackay. Reed Mackay removes the hassle from your travel and event planning, connecting your business globally, keeping your people safe while delivering savings and efficiency, all supported by our 24/7 personal service and global travel platform. We're excited to be joined today by Chris, Adam, and Jennifer. Welcome. And Jennifer, we look forward to hearing what you have to share with us. You can go ahead and take it from there.
Thank you, Joy. Welcome, everybody. I'm Jennifer Achim, the SVP of Sales and Marketing in the U.S. for Reed Mackay. Reed Mackay is celebrating its 10-year anniversary in the U.S. this year, and we are a travel management company for top law firms around the world, including 47 of the AmLaw 100. We're known for high-touch service coupled with forward-thinking technology, and we know the unique needs of law firms in terms of customized travel solutions and frequently changing plans and travel for trials and war rooms and recruitment, confidentiality, security, compliance. And of course, today we're talking about sustainability. So that was just a little commercial, but to give you a little background on who we are and why we're hosting today's masterclass, I would like to hand it over to Adam Braun, the co-founder and CEO of Clarasight, to introduce himself. Adam?
Thank you so much for the kind invite to participate in today's webinar. So really excited to be with you all today. My name is Adam Braun. I'm the co-founder and CEO at Clarasight, as you heard. Clarasight is the leading solution in the software space for carbon planning and intelligence, specifically today focused on business travel. So our team brings both a wealth of knowledge and product capabilities to supporting folks like yourselves on the journey of addressing both sustainability as well as business travel, and excited to be a part of the conversation.
Thanks, Adam. And Chris Truss is here from Reed Mackay, our Global Sustainability Director. Chris?
Hi, everybody. It's lovely to be here and nice to meet you all. My name is Chris, and I, excuse me, lead all of Reed Mackay's activities vis-a-vis sustainability. Broadly speaking, that covers three main areas. So one, I'm actually responsible for Reed Mackay's corporate emissions and our strategy in terms of decarbonisation. So I understand a lot of the challenges that our clients face because I'm living it on a daily basis. Number two, I work across our business to make sure the products and services we deliver meet your needs and help you achieve your decarbonisation goals. And thirdly, I manage the relationships we hold with third-party suppliers and providers of expertise over and above that we as a travel management company provide, ably represented by Adam and Clarasight today. So it's really lovely to meet you all, and I'm looking forward to the next hour of conversation. And any questions that you've got as we go, please fire them through. We'd love to hear from you.
Terrific. So I'll kick off the agenda. So we're going to do a little state of the industry, business travel emissions, and how it relates to law firms specifically, how to get started, your strategies, like what to do next, and how to reduce business travel emissions. So we'll have questions at the end. We have a poll up, and if you'd like to, you can see it probably on the right hand of your screen. Does your firm have emission reduction targets currently? So I am going to now hand it over to Chris to cover sort of the state of the industry. Chris?
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Jennifer. So before we got started in terms of how we reduce emissions related to corporate travel, we thought it would be useful just to start with a 101 in terms of actually what carbon emissions are and what relevance they have for you as law firms. So if you'll excuse me just for one moment, I thought I'd take you through specifically, not understanding exactly who's on the call today, what scopes 1, 2, and 3 are. So scope 1, carbon emissions, relate to any fossil fuels burnt in the day-to-day operation of your organization. Now, for legal firms, this tends to be very, very, very small. Could be company cars that you might have, or it might be any oil or gas boilers that you have within your real estate, but typically it's less than 1% of any overall emissions you have. Scope 2 emissions relate to any electricity that you purchase to manage and operate your business. So all of your offices around the globe will have electricity being provided to them, and your Scope 2 emissions relate to the carbon emissions generated by the production of that electricity. again, relatively small for most law firms. Of much more relevance is scope 3, and that's where corporate travel comes in. But scope 3 covers a very, very wide range of emissions. For example, any purchased goods or services that your business writes checks for on a day-to-day basis, any professional advice, any accountancy firms that you operate with, any third-party provision you have, the catering you have in your offices, etc., etc., etc. They're all your purchased goods and services. There's also your employees working at home or commuting into the office, any capital goods you might purchase, waste you dispose of, and then business travel. Specifically, that's scope 3.6. And what we notice from our client base is that corporate travel can be anywhere between 10 to 40% of a law firm's emissions in totality. And the average that we see is around about 20 to 25% when we look at a typical law firm. So it's a very, very large part of your overall carbon footprint. And that's why it's so material for law firms. Peeling back a layer of the onion, air actually makes up the very largest part of that 10 to 40%. So when we look at our typical clients, air travel is anywhere between 85 to 95% of all of the emissions generated from your corporate travel program. Obviously, there'll be some rail travel in there, there'll be some hotel bookings, there'll be some car hire and such like, but air is the absolute material part of your business travel footprint. So when we look at the totality of your business travel and the totality of the air emissions within that, it's a very, very material part of any law firm's overall carbon footprint. So when we start to understand the fact that it's such a large part of your carbon footprint, why does that matter? Well, I think observationally, what we see from our legal clients is that there's just a growing groundswell of focus and requirement with regards to public commitments and scrutiny when it comes to carbon footprints. And I thought, again, just to kind of level set everybody's knowledge on the call, I'd just talk quickly through some of the major things we see on a global basis. So a very large number of our clients are setting science-based targets. So these are global carbon emission commitments that you and other peers of yours are making to reduce your carbon footprints. We're also seeing a very large number of clients starting to submit their carbon footprints to CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project. We're also seeing in Europe a drive for CSRD, which is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And again, without getting into too much detail, that's a forthcoming regulations, which Adam's going to talk in a bit more detail about later on. And we also see lots and lots of market or sector specific commitments. So one from the legal sector is the Net Zero Lawyers Alliance. All of these public commitments and frameworks and reporting requirements mean that the focus on law firms and their overall carbon footprint is becoming greater and greater. And therefore, it's enormously important, A, to understand the carbon footprint, but B, to understand what makes that up and the fact that business travel and air specifically is such a large part of that. So that's a very, very high level run through of scopes 1, 2, and 3, why it's relevant for the legal sector and what the frameworks that you're expected to report on are. But I'm going to hand over to Adam now, who's going to go into a bit more detail on some of the specifics.
Thank you so much, Chris. So one of the things that we're seeing really quickly emerge within the evolving landscape of both sustainability and travel is two catalysts that are really driving an increased urgency as it relates to not just being able to report and look backwards on your historical emissions, but also to be able to look forwards and with confidence have credible planning and a true pathway to be able to reduce emissions while at the same time delivering substantial value to clients. Now, this creates a natural tension, as I'm sure many of you are experiencing inside of your firms. And what we're witnessing is two primary catalysts that are increasing the urgency that is being felt on a day-over-day basis. For some of you, you might be already deeply familiar with CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive that Chris alluded to, which will be requiring more than 50,000 companies of various sizes that in aggregate represent more than $20 trillion of turnover revenue to not just, again, report on scopes 1, 2, and 3 historically, but for really the first time, an expectation of providing forward-looking targets with credible transition plans. And the really compelling part of CSRD is that unlike elements like the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, which is more of a carrot and a set of incentives, the CSRD is driven by a series of sticks. And so it's ratified at the full EU Parliament level, but the actual enforcement is done on a country by country basis. And in some of the more extreme examples, for non-compliance, France includes jail time. There's also material financial penalties and obviously significant risk that non-compliance surfaces. So what we're seeing is a really significant shift in the tenor, in particular being driven by CSRD out of Europe. But additionally, what we're also seeing is, for many folks, especially with the transition of the new administration here in the US starting yesterday, there's a question around, well, what regulation will impact US-centric firms or businesses? And what we've seen very clearly is because of the nature of the interconnectedness of how emissions are calculated, the emissions that you are generating from your scope 3 category 6 business travel is oftentimes now part of another company's totality of their emissions, just based on the way that this is all interconnected and how it's reported. And so, in aggregate at Clarasight today, we work with primarily, companies that are of a larger size, enterprise to large enterprise, I'll say 800 plus employees. But in many cases, what we're seeing is that as part of the service that you are providing to your key business relationships, there is now an expectation, because you are part of their supply chain, that you, whether you have to be compliant with CSRD or not, you as a supplier are being now asked with increasing velocity to set confident targets, in some cases aligned to the Science Based Targets Initiative, and show year-over-year progress that can be demonstrated, not just as an implication of your own responsibility, but again, to help your clients actually achieve their targets as well. There's some great examples that I can think of where there's, one of the biggest and best known companies in the world is now asking all of their professional service suppliers to reduce the emissions in serving them as a client by 30% related to air travel. And so again, this is creating a new sense of urgency to really get this right, and shifting the conversation and the landscape of carbon emissions from an environmental imperative and a moral imperative to really becoming a business imperative. What I'd like to do next is share a little bit of the insight that our team of experts internally at Clarasight developed just by looking at publicly available information. So we developed a white paper that was really oriented towards looking at some of the leading bodies across the legal industry that aggregate commitments across various firms. And again, this is all pulled from publicly available data, but it's something that the Clarasight team developed, and I wanted to make sure that we brought into this webinar, as I think it'd be really helpful for each of you at your respective firms to understand where you are benchmarked against colleagues. So what you can see in the first column is scope 1 targets that have been set on a near-term basis. So we're talking about 2030 or sooner. The wild thing that I'm sure we all can acknowledge is 2030 is now less than 60 months away. It used to feel like a very, very distant date, but it is now very, very near term for all of us, especially if you're at a larger firm, where, as you probably know, things don't happen overnight. So these are all 2030 or nearer. You see a handful of these closer to, let's say, 2026. But what we've seen is, for many firms, very, very significant reduction targets set on scope 1 and 2. But what's quite compelling is we see a lot of targets that are 50% or more targeted reduction by 2030. And as Chris referenced, and as we've seen consistently in the legal landscape, the majority of emissions for most firms can range from anywhere between, let's say, as low as 30 to 40%, but we see pretty commonly that it's between 60 and 85% of emissions are driven by business travel. And in a world where your asset is your people, and you have to move them from point A to point B in many cases to deliver client value and retain that business. This creates a true fundamental tension that this webinar is really designed to help you understand the best practices and the successful methods in which folks are navigating that challenge with success and with confidence.
So thank you, Adam. That was really insightful. Appreciate that. So now I think we're going to hand it over to Chris. Oh, you're on mute, Chris.
Well, there we go. First blooper of the webinar. So my apologies. What I was saying was that from the perspective of understanding or managing the carbon footprint associated with corporate travel, the first thing you've got to be able to do is measure it. Okay, I'm sure all of you are using a variety of TMCs, and I'm absolutely sure that all of them are able to provide the reporting you need, but it's really, really important to have your hands on that and to understand it. So firstly, you need to be able to calculate accurately the carbon footprint that your firm generates. But then we really need to get under the skin of that and understand what the key things that make that up. Is this billable or non-billable travel? Is it office versus matter? What's driving the requirement? Is it travel to partner conferences? Is it new business development? Is it trade events that you might be traveling to? All of these things start to give us an understanding of what makes up that carbon footprint. Equally, understanding the geographical split of where the emissions are coming from and what is driving that. Is it because you are traveling with huge regularity, or is it because you're traveling relatively infrequently, but always traveling in a premium cabin, for example? So all of these things start to build up a picture of where the emissions are coming from, which part of the business is generating those. And that starts to give us an understanding of how we can start to manage that ongoing. So I think, again, just conscious of the fact we've got a very wide variety of people on the call today, sort of the absolute bedrock of any emissions reduction strategy or commitment or target that you're looking to set or to put into place needs to be based on a really, really solid foundation of good quality, granular, usable information. When we start to understand what that is, then we can start to take a deeper look at how we can actually start to affect change. And Adam's going to talk about that, starting from that baseline.
Sure. So we often see that companies go on a three-part journey, and they oftentimes are at various moments in this journey as of the start of 2025. So one thing that I want to encourage every participant is to understand that today's conversation is really meant as somewhat of a primer and an acknowledgement that for some of you, this might already be 24 to 36 months, maybe even several years into the progression and the growth and scale of your program. But for any of the folks that are at some of the firms where historically this hasn't been top of mind as a conversation, and now it has become, just know that you have great partners out there. Obviously, our team at Clarasight works really closely with Chris and the great folks at Reed Mackay. But there's a number of subject matter experts that can help you navigate these three phases. So the first one we often refer to as the understand phase. And in this case, what we really advocate for is unifying data, which oftentimes comes from disparate sources. And for the purposes of what I'm going to share, it's just going to focus on business travel in this conversation. But over time, for various companies, you need to think about data coming across multiple forms of activities. But I'll tailor all of these comments across the webinar again today to business travel. And so in the business travel context, what you often find is data lives with your TMCs, your travel management companies like Reed Mackay. It also oftentimes may live in your expense management systems, similar to a Chrome River or a Concur, in which case, travel is being booked, let's say, outside of your managed travel program, where someone just, put something on a credit card, but it still ends up in your expense management system. And then in many cases, with the clients that we work with at Clarasight, we're using software to also pull in data from your HR system so that you can start to map the generation of emissions and expenses in one comprehensive kind of single source of truth to show both historicals and then forward-looking forecasts. That second step, once you've established this foundation where you have clarity, that can support both reporting for external purposes as well as internal, where you want to have tailored insights to your various stakeholders, right? Let's say you're a firm that has different folks that need to travel differently in order to serve their clients. They might not want to see one, same size fits all report that isn't particularly relevant to their slice of the business. So you want to empower everybody with similar resourcing to, again, deeply understand what historical performance will be. But from that point, as you emerge into this second category, it becomes really important that as you navigate a journey towards emissions reduction, you take into account the fact that folks never really make decisions around sustainability in isolation from the other important business factors that they're navigating and balancing day to day. So as an example, if you have somebody that needs to go and serve a client, they certainly will likely need to get on a plane if it's a material conversation that has to happen face to face. But to do that time and time again without any understanding of how that will position your year-end emissions creates a real blind spot for you as a firm. And that's where this process of developing forecasts and being able to scenario model the different implications of perhaps rolling particular policies out across the business, and not just doing it on a one-size-fits-all format, but again, tailoring some of the policies or initiatives to the way that different folks need to travel for your business to be successful is really critical. This is where, in this slide, we use the term accounting for the dynamic realities of your business. That might need to incorporate expected headcount growth in a particular market, or the demands of a particular client to either be with them frequently, or for more sustainability conscious clients, they might actually insist that you develop a plan up front in order to limit the emissions that are generated from that engagement. So that's really the second phase that many companies we're now seeing focus on in 2025, which is to complement your foundational understanding with forward-looking forecasting and scenario modeling to develop a collaborative set of plans that can be actioned to both grow the business and scale all of the revenue, headcount, and other core metrics while simultaneously being able to confidently reduce emissions ahead. And then once there's alignment on that core plan, you move into this third phase, which we call ACT here, but it's really moving into a place where you can equip the accountable stakeholders with the tools and resources and visibility to be able to manage effectively towards that target. If we think about the next slide, there are really 5 key milestones that we're often seeing companies navigate in order to be successful in each of these 3 broader strategic phases. As I touched on before, it really does start with data unification and integration. And I don't want to assume anyone's role in this particular call, but what I can share is almost every single day I've spoken to 2 folks already today where they are spending an exorbitant amount of time just in unifying and cleaning data. It's a remarkably painful experience if you're not working with, let's say, a TMC like Reed Mackay that does a fantastic job of ensuring that data integrity is quite high. Or if you're working with multiple TMCs or folks are booking outside of the TMC frequently, there's still a pretty manual process that, again, software solutions can help support. From there, you want to get to a place where reporting is automated, and not just automated for external, but again, automated to be able to deliver the appropriate information to the right person at the right moment in time with the context to help them make a better decision. Then you move into, from that foundational place, your forecasting and your scenario modeling. And it's really important that in the process of developing those 2 elements, you have collaborative input from multiple stakeholders across the business. We always encourage folks to not just develop your forecast and your planning, let's say with a travel function alone. You want to get the relevant input from the business leaders that are going to be making day-to-day decisions and incorporate those into your overall plan. And then eventually the most mature companies get to a point where they roll out carbon targets, in some cases even carbon budgets. And on an ongoing basis, they're able to continue to dynamically incorporate data, leverage that for new forecasts and data that empowers leaders to understand progress against a target and what can position them and the folks that they manage to be able to achieve their particular goals. So the final slide that I'll share in this section talks about how this process actually works across an organization, not just the what of the activities that are ongoing. What we see in many cases at law firms in particular is that sustainability oftentimes rolls up to someone in a chief administrative officer or similar role. And so sustainability in many cases can happen in somewhat of a silo. And what we oftentimes advocate for is that it's done in partnership with the core strategic decision makers at the firm. And then as you move through those 5 milestones that I shared on the previous slide, that you incorporate the relevant functional stakeholders, whether that's your travel department, procurement, workplace services, or otherwise. And then again, you really tailor whether it's reporting, forecasting, scenario modeling, and ultimately targets to the needs of each relevant part of your business. The reality is, your central IT function is likely to need to travel quite differently from, let's say, a senior partner that is responsible for a very substantial book of business. So again, the important part of this slide is really just to acknowledge that you have to gather input and you have to have collaboration, but you want to ultimately ensure that you are cascading this process to the relevant folks in the business, enable them to feel bought in, and make sure that you are capturing the inputs that will enable them to be successful in delivering client value, while at the same time ensuring that you have a credible plan that everyone is aligned on and bought into to be able to achieve the collective targets that have been defined for the firm.
So we have a question, and we're going to probably get into this next. So why don't we start here with this question, which is, some energy efficient travel alternatives requires more travel time, which is not billable. An example would be taking rail versus flying. Is there a formula that helps balance the loss of billable time with energy efficiency? So maybe Chris, you might be able to touch on this.
Yeah, well, firstly, it's a very good question, and I'm not going to be able to give a straightforward answer, but I'm going to do my best. My response to that question would be that no, there isn't a simple formula that helps balance the two. Obviously, the decision is very personal to the individual or to the firm making that choice. But what I would say is it's not always a zero-sum game. Rather, I mean, we have clients, for example, who actually would rather travel on the train because it's more efficient to work and they can generate more billable hours. Now, obviously, that depends upon whether you would view that as billable time or not. But we certainly do have clients that do that. So from that perspective, the equation becomes slightly different. Equally, you could argue between traveling in business class, traveling in economy, are you able to bill time if you're traveling in business class, but not bill time if you're traveling in economy? So there are quite a few different moving parts to that discussion, but I'm not aware of a formula that helps balance that or make it an easy decision. But I'm going to ask Adam, because I don't know, maybe he's come across it. It's not a question I've actually been asked before, I'll be honest with you. Adam, any thoughts on that?
It's a great question. I've yet to be asked if there is a particular formula to balance the loss of billable time with energy efficiency. We've certainly helped many companies design the appropriate and tailored policies based on conversions like air to rail, and map out the implied spend implications as well as the emissions implications. I think the broader point that in this case, it looks like Ron asked this question, which is really important, is, as I alluded to before, emissions should never be taken into account in isolation from your business reality. And so I've yet to see a kind of one size fits all formula, but we've certainly helped many companies take into account, with the known data that we have, the anticipated implications of modeling out some type of initiative shift, in this case from air to rail, in terms of both spend and emissions impact as well.
Yeah. Ron, I'm not sure if we answered your question or not, but it certainly is a very good one, and it's a new one on me. So thank you very much for that. What we wanted to do now is just quickly run through some of the kind of the practical steps you could take to try to reduce the impact you have from corporate travel. And as Adam's already said, some of these will be applicable and will build into your plan, and some of them are just going to be thrown straight out because they're not going to work for each individual business. So it's very personal. But look, the first thing we need to say is that the simplest way to reduce your emissions is not get on a plane. And sounds slightly counterintuitive for somebody who works for a corporate travel agent to be saying that, but it's really, really important that that's acknowledged as the primary route to achieving very, very swift emissions reduction. And I would encourage all firms, in fact, all of our clients, to look at the travel they undertake to ensure that the travel they are doing is with purpose and with a defined business outcome, because that's going to be your low-hanging fruit. The next step would be to reduce the demand. And what we see is oftentimes clients will be sending multiple individuals to the same meeting, or they'll be sending multiple people to the same locations for very, very similar purposes over a period of time. And by looking at your travel patterns, by looking at the people who are traveling, often there's a capability or an ability to identify the ability to squash and reduce the demand or the number of people that you're sending for generally similar tasks to similar locations. We've obviously then got the ability to change modes, and this is the point that Ron very called out earlier on, which is, you know, a switch from air to rail is a very, very obvious route to decarbonising. But firstly, does a rail route that's practical exist on the route that you're travelling? Question mark. Secondly, is it a time gain which is going to actually meet your needs? You know, it's not reasonable to expect somebody to spend 15 hours sat on a train when there's a 2-hour flight that's available, for example. So again, just looking at these different abilities to change the way that you travel will help to reduce overall. And then the final one is to reduce the intensity of the travel. So this could be very simply moving from business class to premium economy or to economy, because that reduces the impact of that individual traveller. That could be one option. It could be looking at the various different carriers available on a particular day and looking at who's flying the most efficient aircraft on that particular route, for example. So there are various different ways that we can reduce the emission intensity. So even if you do choose to travel by plane, you can still reduce the impact that that travel has. And I'm going to walk through a couple of examples of that in just a moment. I just wanted to address another question that's come up on the chat, which is, given that we represent our client Scope 3, so I presume in the context, Paulina, you're saying, given that law firms represent part of a client's Scope 3, logically, they would want you to reduce it in the near future. So I think what you're referencing there is a dynamic that we often see. So law firms will be pressured by their clients to reduce their carbon footprints, because obviously as part of your client's Scope 3, if everybody reduces, then by virtue of that, everybody's emissions reduce. We are starting to see that. We actually have some law firms that we work with who have specific travel policies for specific clients who mandate, for example, that they aren't allowed to travel in business class when they're traveling on that particular client's business, for example. So we are starting to see that feed in, where we have very, very mandatory or specific policies that individual clients are imposing upon their law firm. But it's not something that we see as a blanket. But you're absolutely right. Logically, everybody essentially wants the same thing. It's just, as you can see from some of the conversations we're having, it's not necessarily an easily achieved objective. So Paulina, I hope I've answered your question there, but please follow up if there's anything else you want me to cover. So just looking at a couple of these practical examples, what I'm showing you here is one example of where we can look at particular routes and understand what our behaviour is and how we can change that behaviour to reduce the emission intensity of that route. So London to New York is the biggest route that Reed Mackay's legal clients fly, and we can see that, you know, over 80% of that travel is in the premium cabins, business class or first class. It seems really, really obvious to say, but if we can start to move some of the bodies from those premium cabins into premium economy or economy, then there is a natural reduction in the emissions intensity of that route that you will benefit from. And that applies across the board. Now, this can be achieved by having stricter travel approvals in place, by starting to have conversations with particular parts of the business, by starting to set more specific goals and targets for individual travellers. But it is important to say that none of this is achieved easily. And my approach would always be to go with the salami slicer type thing, just to chip away at the overall target, because trying to have one silver bullet that's going to solve the problem overnight is quite challenging. I think if we then look at some of the more nuanced or the more granular information that's available to us, we can start to see that on individual routes, and I'm hoping that the slide is magically going to move to the next one here. If we start to look at some individual routes, we can see that the dynamic between business class and economy is there. So I can see on this particular route between JFK and London Heathrow, if I travel in business class, my emissions are around about 4,000 kilograms in business class and around about 1,000 kilograms in economy. So there's an enormous saving by switching somebody from business to economy. But at the same time, if I fly on the 11 p.m. departure from JFK to London Heathrow, my emissions in business class are 4,217, whereas if I take the 11:59 departure, my emissions drop to 3,800 or thereabouts. That dynamic is being driven by the type of plane that's being flown on that particular route at that particular time, on the load factor of that flight, on the engines used and the age of those engines, on the seating configuration, and all of those granular factors start to give a differential. So even if you can start to push people to the right option on a particular day or a particular flight or a particular time, that can also start to really, really help. So as we start to get into the nuance and the detail of these things, there are ways that we can start to affect the impact by behavioral change and driving people to make the right choice. The final thing we want to do is to make it personal. So we want to give people an individual understanding of what their impact is. So, I would encourage everybody to start looking at what kind of reporting can be generated to make people understand the impact of their travel and make them understand what that means to them individually and what that means to the overall context of the firm they're working for. So if there is an emissions reduction target in place, what is the percentage that individual is impacting, and is their behavior better or worse than that of their peers or their colleagues? Or what does that look like as a benchmark against the wider industry, for example? So trying to make it individual, relevant, insightful will really help to understand how people are traveling and hopefully to make them change their behavior, because fundamentally that's what this is. This is, we have ingrained behaviors that we undertake when we travel, and it's trying to shift that behavior to get the behavior we want from our travelers. I'm just going to very, very quickly walk through a specific example of this. So one of our global professional service clients was developing its SBTI roadmap. So they're trying to decarbonize their business, and they needed to change behavior to reduce their business travel emissions. So some of the practical things that they did were to look very, very closely at their travel policy. And I think I can't overstate the importance that having the buy-in of the business, the buy-in of the management team, the buy-in of the partnership to the goals that you're trying to set. If you don't have that support and you don't have a clearly articulated travel policy that supports that, it's going to be really, really difficult to get positive results. We then built bespoke dashboards for them with traffic light systems showing the carbon emissions relevant to that particular trip. And we also brought about very, very focused sustainability reporting for them, which actually impacted it very, very positively to reduce the number of trips that people were taking by 52% overall. So that actually brought about an overall 70% reduction in their carbon emissions on a program year, which was obviously very, very positive. Now, I'll be honest with you, that was immediately post-COVID. And one of the biggest challenges that this firm have is now maintaining that positive momentum, because again, targets are ever decreasing. So it's a constant game of whack-a-mole, if you like, to make sure that you keep the pressure on, and it's a continuous positive momentum. Thanks very much, Megan. And Adam, I'm going to hand over to you now, because I've talked very quickly about some of the very high-level approaches, but I think hopefully the point I made was that, there are lots of granular items that can be addressed here, and I think you're going to walk us through some of those, so thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would just encourage those that are with us live to feel free to submit any questions into the chat. Chris and I can see those coming through. Jennifer will certainly call those out as well. So again, love to have any questions that would be helpful to make sure that this is tailored to what's most top of mind for you all that are present with us. So what I wanted to chat through in this slide is a number of the leading mechanisms that we often see companies and are closely partnering with them to really navigate this journey of going from, hey, we just need to get a handle on our emissions, to we actually need to balance this set of priorities that was alluded to in some of the previous questions around ensuring that we can continue to deliver client value, because that's our primary objective and responsibility as a firm, while now successfully ensuring that we can reduce emissions ahead at the same time. And that again creates a very material tension that it's really important that you're able to leverage a set of best practices to be able to successfully ensure you can achieve the outcomes both for the business and for your sustainability commitments. So we talked about this a little bit earlier, but oftentimes in the journey, getting a couple layers more granular, what we see folks do that are really ensuring success within their program is in that context of understanding and forecasting emissions, they start by developing what we call a BAU, or business as usual emissions forecast. And so that often requires ingesting your historical travel data. That could be from one or potentially multiple TMCs, but always better if it's unified. And we always encourage folks to move to kind of one true TMC across your markets. And then also model in the known business inputs related to expected growth. So again, that could be headcount growth, could be revenue, could be some of the other metrics that any business measures itself against, client engagements or otherwise. And then in many cases, one of the things that we're seeing our clients really value is automating, again, through software, the ability to look at the variance between where you are forecasted to be on what we'll call the BAU forecast versus your targets. And that becomes a real catalyst for conversation with leadership to say, yes, we've set a target, but now we have the ability to look into the future. And if we continue on the path that we're on, we're going to miss that target by, let's say, 55%. And that creates material risk for us because clients are asking for proof that we have a credible plan to reduce emissions, as well as what we find consistently with law firms is you're in the risk mitigation business on behalf of your clients, and they're now asking you to not just talk the talk, but to walk the walk yourselves. So this is often combined with a revenue protection conversation to really make this a true business imperative. Next, we often see companies really determine what are the relevant KPIs and the drivers that are going to enable them to achieve the core initiatives that matter most. And that is really tailored to each individual business. We know that each of you operate quite differently. And then you want to make sure that you can really automate and take out a lot of the manual effort that goes into the reporting for both internal and external stakeholders. This was touched on a little bit earlier as well, but we very frequently in conversations with the legal firms that we work with, and our kind of bread and butter is the professional services space for the obvious reason that we focus on helping companies reduce emissions while balancing business needs and business travel, and professional services is an industry where emissions are primarily generated from business travel. There's oftentimes this conversation around, in particular from senior leadership and partners, that we never want to inhibit our ability to be with the client if they need us. And how are we supposed to continue to deliver the same value if we're not able to get, let's say, on the plane at the same frequency as before? And so in this case, what we often find is companies drastically underestimate the amount of travel that is occurring for internal purposes, and they overestimate the emissions that are generated from sales and business development and client services related activities. This is public, but I was on a webinar with the Chief Sustainability Officer of one of the largest and most well-known and kind of elite professional services firms out there. And he was tasked with really navigating this same complex journey And the partnership effectively said, we can't reduce emissions based on the commitments that have been made because we have to continue to serve our clients successfully. And when they really mined the data, what they saw was 50% of the emissions that were being generated were exclusively driven by internal travel purposes. And in fact, one of the largest drivers of those emissions was an annual partner gathering where everyone was flying to a very inconvenient location, business class with a significant other. And they didn't actually have to tweak the client delivery model that they had established and had enabled them to be successful in order to achieve their targets. They just needed to be willing to make some modifications related to their internal travel. So we oftentimes encourage, especially those of you that are on this call, I would imagine to some extent you've been tasked with the responsibility to help navigate and lead through this journey. So plan and really optimize for internal travel first, enabling the granular information to surface so that folks can have better conversations about how to achieve those important outcomes. There's oftentimes a set of best practices and recommendations that by working with, let's say, someone with Chris's background or mine or some of the other folks that are out there in this space, we can really help you get up the curve quite quickly on. And then there's a lot of power in optimizing the actual location and the attendees and the modes of travel that enable folks to get to these big seminal internal meetings that can create very material reductions of emissions without actually impacting the experience of the attendees, and then continue to, again, kind of track and report out on those KPIs and really celebrate the successes, create a conversation around it, and ensure that you have a lot of quick and hopefully quite visible wins that people are excited about. As we move into this big bucket number 3 around planning and optimizing client travel, again, you want to develop more granular plans based on your client's requirements and expectations. So we always start with service orientation. And then from there, you want to really start to move into a place where you're leading with the actionable drivers. So you might have particular routes as you look at the data that you can optimize for. It might be the mode or the method of engagement. And more than anything, we always try and encourage folks to minimize business disruption while, again, optimizing meetings and events, in this case, client-facing. And then these last 2 big buckets are really around engaging those key stakeholders internally, and then implementing the mechanisms to drive accountability so that folks have the right both visibility and the right set of expectations to be able to ensure that they can actually achieve success. I'll very quickly just touch on a recent case study with a global law firm. In their case, the tipping point for action was not driven by regulatory, it was driven by client demand. And so a very large and important client requested the insertion of decarbonization goals into part of the service agreement. And there was an expectation that within a 30-year timeline, the previous marker, that was set as 30 years was moved to 3 years. And so the failure to achieve this would then potentially inhibit the ability to renew that contract. So again, really important catalyst for action driven by business and client. The business case was then built by the internal leader that was responsible for driving this. And I share this because I think it's important for those of you that have been tasked with the responsibility, but now need to go about securing stakeholder buy-in, was to look at the cost of inaction. So rather than saying, what is it going to cost us to do this? They've really flipped it on its head and said, what would be at risk if we weren't able to achieve these targets with confidence and credibility? And as they modeled it out, it turns out, substantial 8 figures of revenue at risk. And then they looked more broadly, and I always encourage folks in sustainability positions to do this, is to look at, let's say, your top 10 or your top 25 clients, and how many of them have set science-based targets. It was announced earlier this morning, we're now at the point where 10,000 companies have set science-based targets. And so if you look at how much risk does that create, because you are now part of their ability to achieve their goals, in this case, over $350 million of potential revenue at risk. And that became the catalyst for, if we move into this next slide, them really moving into a place where they said, all right, we have to have confident and credible ability to not only have a foundation of data to look backwards, but also to look forwards as well. And so they set, again, very aggressive reduction targets to a near-term window. They were able to do so. In this case, we enabled them to leverage both the data from Reed Mackay and the software capabilities in conjunction to the partnership that we have at Clarasight with the folks at Reed Mackay to really be able to not only forecast going forward, but then to a scenario model with rapid efficiency and quite powerful capabilities to align forecasts and potential scenarios with these business realities to then get secured buy-in to adopt a set of measures to be able to confidently hit those targets in the coming years. So just to kind of wrap up and summarize, and then we'll move into the broader Q&A, I think it's really important to call out that on this journey that has brought us all together, right, of ensuring that you can confidently achieve emissions reduction from your business travel while continuing to deliver client value as a law firm, it's important that you really frame sustainability not as an environmental imperative, but as a business imperative. Speak the language in which leadership and partners are motivated. And once you've established that core foundation of data that powers your historical reporting, what we're seeing is it's just become absolutely critical to be able to also complement that with robust forward-looking planning and align your forecasts, which may likely show that you're off track from your targets without material changes, to these what-if scenarios that are driven by the true business realities that can enable you to be successful. And then once you have collective buy-in towards that set of aggregated goals and the pathway in which you will get there, it's really important that you not just empower your internal leaders to manage their teams towards success, but that you proactively manage emissions reduction with your clients. That these are a part of conversations, whether they are facilitating and initiating them, or whether you're bringing them to the table. And ultimately, we strongly advocate, and we're seeing tremendous value from the folks that are turning this from a reporting and a regulatory set of requirements actually into a competitive advantage in the way that they are positioning their firms and their capabilities to serve their clients. One thing that I wanted to offer as a free resource to those of you that are on the webinar with us is a white paper that we developed. You saw a little bit earlier a graphic that showed the benchmarking of a bunch of the commitments of various leading legal firms. You can also find that on the Clarasight website under the resources section. That's a guide to achieving net zero as a law firm. But this is more of a broad and holistic white paper that we developed that pulls together a series of best practices. It's called the Definitive Guide to Sustainable Business Travel Excellence. This can be used by either sustainability leaders, travel leaders, or just folks that are responsible for managing teams on a day-to-day basis. You can see the QR code, or you can find that in the resources section at clarasight.com. But just wanted to make sure that that was provided as a resource and a takeaway so that this conversation doesn't just end today, but it's something that you can continue to implement ahead.
Thank you, Adam. So we're going to go to questions. I have one here because I think we did a pretty good job of talking like very high level on what the firm needs to do, or at least some practical steps. What about convincing the travelers, right? The question is, how can you convince hesitant travelers to get on board? So I don't know if Chris or Adam, this fills up your alley.
I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all solution. I think part of it is carrot, part of it is stick, part of it is communication, part of it's having very, very clear guidelines and policies. But there's no doubting the fact that achieving the behavioural change is really, really difficult. And I think you have to have a really wide range of tools at your disposal to achieve that. I suppose to a certain extent, it depends why the traveller is hesitant. If the traveller is hesitant because they'd rather travel on British Airways business class or American Airlines business class because they've got Avios points that they want to protect, I would say that that's not an acceptable reason. But if they've got a reason which is, well, I need to travel in business class because of a health condition, okay, well, fair enough. So I think it very much depends on the battle you're trying to fight and the individual involved. But I think ultimately it stems from, you've got to have a really clear position, very clear policy. You've got to engage with them. You've got to give them the context of why it's important. you know, if we don't decarbonize, we will lose 10 of our largest clients and our business will shrink. That's quite a compelling reason to act, to change your behavior. So I think if people can understand that, and you've got senior buy-in, but there is no, in my opinion, there isn't an easy way to achieve it. It's lots of conversations, lots of, different strategies and tactics need to be employed according to the situation. I don't know if Adam's got a more succinct answer than that.
I think we see that there's various mechanisms that folks have tried to employ to drive changes in traveler behavior. The most successful that we've seen implemented is a combination of two things together. It doesn't mean that everybody can do this. It often really requires, I would say, CEO or C-suite level sponsorship and commitment to it. But the first is when you tie people's compensation to staying within a particular emissions target. So aligning this to, again, the incentives that most people are motivated by includes compensation. So we see many organizations today. In fact, I believe I saw a stat yesterday. It was either 60 or 80% of those that are on target to achieve their emissions reduction goals have tied executive compensation to those goals. So it's a really powerful motivator. That's one. And then the second is when they also incorporate that with cascading carbon targets to each segment of the business. So, and I share that without actually including the requirement to change policy. We work with a number of customers today that were really hesitant to mandate a big, swift change in policy because they knew that people liked their business class trip, even if it was, a short haul from, let's say, New York to Boston. And they didn't really want to create an internal uproar around that. But what we've seen as a really powerful driver is just giving people a target and making it clear that you are expected to stay within a particular range over a particular duration of time. It's oftentimes annually, and then giving them visibility into performance against that and even forecast as to where they're expected to be. That's the powerful motivator. Allow them to have the autonomy. And then realistically, I might actually want to get on a business class flight, but then not, take business class, but take train for 2 other similar trips. But allowing me to make that choice, I think, is really important in the modern context. But that combination of tying to compensation and then also having visibility into performance against a goal, we've seen as the most powerful driver to lead to actual behavior change.
Thank you, Adam and Chris. We are just about at time, and we just wanted to thank everyone for attending our masterclass. If you need support with emissions reductions when it comes to business travel, please get in touch with us